Hello again, and welcome to the Small Town Pastors vlog. I'm Nate Babcock, the preacher at Buchanan Christian Church in Buchanan, Michigan. My partner in crime is Mr. Keith Robinson, who is the pastor at Cave City Christian Church in Cave City, Kentucky. And today we are continuing our discussion about church leadership. We began this vlog by looking at the book of Nehemiah and what we can learn from Nehemiah's example, and some general leadership principles. And then we spent the last several episodes talking about elders, the role of elders in the local church. And we've tried to answer that, a set of questions about eldership, both biblically and practically. And now we're going to turn our attention to deacons with the same goal, to try to answer some questions about the role of deacons in the local church, both biblically and practically. So Keith, get us started in this conversation.
All righty. So I'm going to say just right off the bat that this is not a conversation that is easy to have, purely because there is so little material to work with. Nate and I were just talking about this a little bit ago, but there are very few passages in Scripture that actually talk about deacons, either as a concept or in practical terms of what they are doing. There are very few written books in recent times that deal with this. My favorite one, and again, I was telling Nate this a little bit ago, I have two different books that are by the same author who they're primarily directed at elders. One is elders in the church life, and then the other is 40 questions about elders and deacons. Of the 40 questions, I think 34 of them are elders and the rest are deacons. But both of those books, when you get to the deacon section, it's just the exact same material, word for word, copied and pasted over. But it's almost impossible to actually find information that's practical and useful for deacons. So hopefully this conversation will help with that a little bit. No promises.
No promises.
When we ask the question, what is a deacon? There are a couple of caveats that we have to talk about. And we did this when we started our conversation about elders as well. Just as with elders, how we envision church government, what methods we grew up with or what methods we currently use or most familiar with, that's inevitably going to affect how we answer this question. So we kind of have to first determine how we're going to answer that question before we actually give an answer to that question. And this is perhaps even more convoluted for deacons than it is for elders, just in the sense that different denominations have very different ideas of what a deacon is. So a good example of this would be a lot of Baptists will have deacons in their church as a role at the local level. And when you start picking apart what their deacons are, it's essentially what we described as being elders. That they are the ones who make the spiritual decisions. They are the ones who have oversight of the congregation. They are the ones that are, just over everything. And then if they have elders or use the term elders, that's like a group that's over multiple congregations within their denomination rather than one specific one. So what we would call elders in that context, they would call deacons. And this is, not unique to them. There are lots of different groups and they have lots of different answers to this. And then there are quite a few churches that just don't have deacons at all. They have elders or they have presbyters or they have some other type of leader, but they don't have deacons. So Nate, I want to throw this over to you for a second and say, all right, if there's all of this debacle and misunderstanding, or maybe not misunderstanding, but differences in understanding of what a deacon is, how do we go about actually trying to answer the question, what is a deacon?
Well, I think our method, Keith, is to try to take as straightforward a look as we can at the biblical terminology and examples, even though, as you said, the biblical material is slim and not all of it is particularly clear. And of course, how we look at the examples and terminology is informed by the background that we're coming from, as you've just said. We tend to kind of read our own practices and understandings into the biblical text. So we want to try to bracket that as much as possible, right? And hear the biblical text on its own terms. I think you and I have alluded to Acts 6 several times in our conversations as the passage that is often thought of as the kind of place in the history of the early church where deaconship emerged, right? And that was in response to a need. The early church, which you had Greek-speaking Jews and Hebrew-speaking Jews, right? Is that right, Keith?
Yes.
They're in the church in Jerusalem.
Yep.
And they were, as Acts chapters 2 and 4 describe, the early Christians were active in meeting one another's needs and caring for one another. But as the church continued to grow, the challenge associated with meeting one another's material needs became greater. And there came a point where the needs of the Greek-speaking widows, again, these were Jewish people, but Greek-speaking Jews, those widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. And a complaint arose about this. And the apostles, in response to that complaint, said, this is important, but it's not something we personally can give our attention to, right? They wanted to devote themselves to the word of God and to prayer. So they told the congregation to appoint from among themselves it was 7 men, right? That's what they said. 7 men known to be full of the Holy Spirit and of wisdom, right? To see to this matter, to making sure that justice was done and nobody was being overlooked, right? And there wasn't any prejudice that was causing that certain people were being overlooked. And so those 7 men, and I think all of them have Greek names, isn't that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, in Acts 6, they all have Greek names, so which is an interesting consideration, that they probably come from the community within the church whose widows were being overlooked,
right?
Most likely. Those 7 men are chosen, and the word deacon, or the Greek word that we translate as deacon sometimes in the New Testament, is not used in Acts 6, but the verb is. Is that right? The diakoneo, to serve, basically, or to minister. Isn't that where the apostles said, we can't wait on tables, right? The word we translate as wait is diakoneo, to serve or to minister. And so because of that terminological link, at least in part due to that, Acts 6 is often thought of as, okay, this is where deaconship emerged in the early church. How do you evaluate that, Keith? Do you think that's accurate? Do you think it's accurate to describe those 7 men as deacons, and that is what happened there is the origination of deaconship in the church?
So I think, and this is sort of another one of those, what your background is going to color how you answer the question. There is, at least in my mind, there's a debate between how official of an office that of deacon is. I think you can make the case that there is an actual leadership position that we call deacon. And if that is the case, it makes sense that Acts 6 would be the starting point for that they saw this need occurring and therefore chose individuals to help meet that need. And then as similar situations happened in other congregations, they followed that model. And so it sort of just became standardized as a practice over time. But because, and we'll get into this when we talk about the terminology itself, but because of what the word deacon actually means, just, waiter or servant, you could just as easily make the argument that it's not a leadership position or even an official position at all. It's just when we're encountering this term, talking about those individuals who are serving in the church. And if that's the case, Acts 6 isn't the creation of an office or the selecting of leaders, but the choosing of individuals to serve a specific ministry need.
Right, for a specific time.
Yes.
And as you point out, Keith, in our notes for this, some at least of those men went on to do other things, right? It's not like they just remained as deacons of the Jerusalem church.
Right.
Stephen and Philip became traveling evangelists and preachers, you
Right.
know.
And the other 5 we know nothing about.
Right, we have no, yeah, right. But so the point is, it's not like that was like their once, they were appointed to that role, they were stuck with it.
Yes.
I see both sides of the argument, or both ways to look at the passage. It's difficult to answer the question, decisively.
Mhm.
Some scholars would say that the whole idea of there being fixed official positions of leadership in the local church is a later development, right? That this is why some scholars think of the pastoral epistles, Timothy and Titus, as having been written like near the end of the first century,
Mhm.
and not by Paul himself, because Timothy and Titus seem to envision, elders and deacons as official offices and roles in the local church, kind of structured hierarchy of authority. And the argument is, well, it wasn't that way in Paul's lifetime. It couldn't have been. This has to come from later on down the road. I certainly don't buy that necessarily, but it does seem, I think it's an open question whether or not Acts 6 is actually the establishment of an office.
Right. And again, even if we take the traditional approach of Timothy and Titus being, written by Paul in the late 60s AD,
Right.
There's still a 20-30 year gap between Acts 6 and 1 Timothy 3, which is the really one and only passage that deals with the deacons as a specific office.
Right.
As such.
So there's certainly time for development in those couple of decades.
Yeah. And that development could be, just that, we did this once where there was a need and we chose some people to meet that need and said, hey, that's a good idea. Let's do that more often when other needs arise. And then, let's just start it before the needs arise.
Right. And I think that's a fairly helpful way to look at it, actually, because when you think about the terminology, both the noun and the verb just refers to, a person who serves, or the act of serving, right? It's not specific. It's very general.
Right.
And so, the deacon is the person, or the deacons are the people who serve, and that's a fairly open-ended job description. It could be, and that could take one form, Keith, in your congregation, where deacons have a specific set of serving responsibilities because your congregation has a specific set of needs, right? Like the Jerusalem church had the need of making sure that food distribution was being done in a just and fair way,
Mhm.
right? Well, and my congregation might have a different set of needs,
Right.
and so our deacons need to serve differently, And if we just, I think that is a helpful way to look at it. That if you want to call it an office, fine, but the point is, these are people that are appointed to serve the needs of the congregation, whatever those needs happen to be.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. And I think if we use that as our starting point, that whether we're talking about an official office or not, we're talking about people who are serving. Mm-hmm. That's going to go a long way in helping answer the question of, all right, what is a deacon? What should a deacon be doing? How do we select those deacons? All that kind of stuff. Because at the overarching goal is service, is meeting the needs of the people that make up the church.
Yeah. So, and in that sense, there are a lot of roles in the church that could be considered, to have a deaconish quality to them, right? A small group leader,
Mm-hmm.
Could be a deacon, right? Just as easily, we often do associate deacons with meeting physical needs, right? Because of the Act 6 example, deacons are the ones that, fix the plumbing in the church building, or, deacons are the ones that, handle the distribution of the elements, communion during the worship service, or, all those are very valuable and important things. But I don't know that it's necessary to limit the service of deacons to just those kinds of roles. If we have this kind of open-ended, serving whatever the needs of the congregation happen to be kind of mindset about it. So I was actually going to read, Keith, that passage in 1 Timothy 3.
Okay.
It's the only one we've got, like you said, that is really about deacons. I think is it Philippians, maybe in the
Yeah.
in Philippians, Paul says, he specifically greets the deacons in the church or something like that.
Yeah, I have that here somewhere.
Yeah.
Somewhere. Somewhere.
I think it is.
Philippians 1:1. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Where Paul, and he says, to the congregation of the church in Philippi and the elders and the deacons.
Yeah.
So he singles out the leaders within the congregation, and he uses both terms, elders and deacons.
Right. And so there is an example from Paul's own lifetime in a letter that just about everybody agrees was written by Paul. Right. Where he is to that congregation saying, okay, there are both of these roles or offices within the local church that he's writing to, So.
And then the other example is in Romans 16, where there is Phoebe, who is labeled with the term diakonos.
Yes.
So she is called we usually translate it just as servant of the church of Syncrea, but the word servant is the same word deacon. So we could just as easily say that Phoebe is a deacon of the church in Syncrea.
The cynical part of me says that translation as servant is ideologically motivated, right? If her name was masculine rather than feminine, we would translate it as deacon, no problem.
Right.
Know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, we run into something similar, when you read First
in
Timothy
this passage.
3,
Yeah.
There's a verse in there that talks about a group of women. Now,
Yes.
who are they? Are they the wives of the deacons, which is what a lot of translations do? The deacons' wives have to be this. Are they just women in general? Are they, deaconesses? Is there a female equivalent of this office? Are they just female deacons that there's no, difference? It's just the men who are deacons and the women who are deacons.
Do you have your Greek New Testament in front of you?
I do not. I have Reese's commentary, which would give a lot of the.
I'm just wondering what verse 8 is it? No, not verse 8. What is it? Verse 11.
11.
Here I have the English Standard Version, and I'll read the whole paragraph in a moment. But I have the English Standard Version, and their rendering is their wives.
Yeah, I think the word is gunaikos, which can be women or can be wives in general. I'm looking it up.
But is the possessive pronoun there?
That's what I'm trying to figure out. And I'm sure people watching at home are exhilarated by this part of the conversation.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sorry. A little bit of a nerd trip here.
So you were looking at verse 11?
Yeah, verse 11. Yeah.
It's just gunaikos. The women must likewise hosatos be dignified, semnas me diabolos, not malicious God. There's no pronoun.
No possessive pronoun.
No.
That drives me crazy when translations do things like that. I mean, I can understand the translation of wives, but to insert, and I know what they're trying to make sense of it, right? To insert that pronoun there like they do. Anyway, enough on that.
For those of you watching at home that are completely lost and wondering what on earth we are talking about and why we're talking about it, when you get to 1 Timothy 3:11, there is embedded in this conversation. So Paul has, in the first part of the chapter, talked about elders, and then in verse 8, he says deacons likewise, so in similar manner to the elders. And then verse 11, we have this term that means women. And the question is, are these women a specific group of people? Are they linked to deacons, since Paul is going to continue talking about deacons in the next verse? Or is there something else going on? And this whole issue of whether or not there's a possessive pronoun, if there was one, it would give a whole lot more credence to what most translators do, and
Right.
these are the deacons' wives. Now
Yeah.
that they are the women who are possessed by the deacons from the previous verses. But because that
Yes.
pronoun isn't there, it's much more open-ended, that they could still, I guess, be linked. And again, most translators take that approach, but they could just as easily be their own separate group of people.
Right. Women, and the implication would be women servants or women deacons, right? Yes. So we don't need to go too much further into that whole conversation. It is a good example, however, of, even if you're not familiar with the original biblical languages, of why it's important to read English translations with a bit of a critical eye, right? And it's important to, if you're not familiar with the biblical languages, it's important to have 2 or 3 or 4 English translations, good English translations that you can set side by side, because often the underlying translation issues that you wouldn't be aware of if you don't know the languages will surface in the differences between translations, right? And that can, okay, so one translation might say their wives, and the next, a different one might say the women, right? And okay, that doesn't mean the same thing. Their wives and the women doesn't mean the same thing. And so that can raise a question in your mind, what's going on here? And then you go talk to a pastor, you go talk to, you do your own online research, you try to find out what's going on. And so it is a good example of why it's important to read English translations with a bit of a critical eye.
And this isn't, we're not being super critical of the translators themselves.
No, they have to make decisions.
Yeah, and it's the reality is that no 2 languages in general have a 1-to-1 ratio exactly. Word that this word means this word every single time.
Right.
And so when you come across words or concepts that are very different from one language to the next, you're forced to make a decision on how you're going to address that. And a lot of times you end up losing something along the way just because there's no way to do it without going into like super detail of why you decided to do what you did.
Right. And you got to use like 9 words to translate one. It's like, okay, that's just confusing and causes more problems. So, okay. Maybe Keith will do some episodes on Bible translation sometime.
Well, I would enjoy it.
And Bible English.
If that's something you would be interested as well, or if that's just
right.
They're going to do that.
Hey, we always said this conversation's for the benefit of the 2 of us primarily. So if we want to nerd out, we can nerd out. Okay. So here's the passage after all of that rabbit trail. 1 Timothy 3, 8 through 13. Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. It's interesting because there's not a similar requirement for elders.
Right.
Maybe it's just an assumption. I don't know. Their wives, verse 11, must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. So, this is a character description, right? The qualifications here all have to do with character. There's even less of a job description here than there is for elders in the previous paragraph.
Right.
So at least for elders, it says, they need to be able to teach, right? It doesn't even say that about deacons, and verse 13, those who serve well, right? Again, giving the, like, as we've already talked about, the general idea of the deacon, as a role or as an office is to serve, whatever that form that takes. And Paul's not specific about what form that takes.
Right. Yeah. So when we looked at the qualification list for elders found in verses 1 through 7 of this chapter, this was like 3 episodes ago now, we sort of broke it down into, these are character traits that describe, the elder's personal life, his life within the congregation, his life, and work relationships, that kind of stuff. And it's, when we're trying to figure out who's going to serve as an elder, it's not that this is a checklist that, okay, he's, 9 times out of 10, he meets this one or anything like that. It's a question of character and how that character works itself out in the messiness of life as a whole.
Yes.
And the same thing has to be true of this passage as well, maybe more so of this passage, that when we're looking at deacons and who should be deacons and all that, it's a question of character. It's a question of how that character works itself out in life, more so than, all right, he's done this, so he gets the job.
Right.
Or she.
Yeah. For sure. So, and much of what Paul says in that paragraph about the character qualifications for deacons is similar to what he's already said about elders.
Yeah.
It's not quite as extensive, but the kind of the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots of the passage are pretty similar. Yeah.
Well, and we'll dive into the language again for a moment, because it starts off with the likewise deacons must be. It's a strong indicator that these two passages are meant to be taken together.
Yes.
If there is something that is specific for the elders but not specific for the deacons, it's still a good character trait for the deacons to have.
Yes.
And same way, if there's something in the deacon passage that's not in the elder passage, well, the elders likewise should be able to say this is true of us.
Yes. So there's to be this kind of continuity of character across the leadership spectrum of the local church. Whether you're talking about elders or deacons, they're to share the same basic, character traits. And, all of this is, the idea is that all of this exhibits, their internal commitment to Christ, right? And their growth in godliness. And again, the requirement isn't perfection. And I don't think that we're meant to approach these qualification lists as you've got to check every box and you can't have any weaknesses in any area before you're allowed to serve, right? Because then none of us would qualify, But on the whole, taken as a whole, are we looking at someone who does have a proven track record of being a mature, growing follower of Jesus, right?
Well, we talked about this in our first video on eldership. So, if you want more specifics on some of this stuff, we would highly encourage you to go back to that one, where we dove into this in quite a bit of detail. When we talk about, all right, so how do we interpret or apply some of these qualifications? The goal here is more of an indication, again, rather than a checklist. So, one of the easy examples is the deacon must be a husband of one wife, and the elder must be a husband of one wife. Well, does that mean that he has to be married? Does that mean that if he's been married but his wife has passed away, that he can't be married again? Or, that's a conversation that needs to happen. But the purpose behind what Paul is saying has more to do with the faithfulness of the husband to the wife than that. All right, he got married, so that's one of the box checked. He's the husband of a wife, so he's qualified now, and he hasn't gotten divorced, he hasn't been widowed, so he still marks that one. That's not the purpose here.
No, not at all. And because in that cultural context, right, it was, especially I think for more upper class, well-to-do men, socially ascendant men, it was perfectly acceptable from a Roman or Greek perspective for men to have, sexual relationships with other women outside of marriage. Right? It wasn't considered adultery for them, not from a legal perspective.
Right.
And
for the Jewish people, it wasn't really that unexpected for a man to divorce his wife and get married again if he decided.
Right.
There was a bit of a going on there, but some of the religious leaders said, your wife burned your meal, give her a certificate of divorce, get a new one.
Right. Get a better cook.
Yeah.
So again, that's the idea, is if the deacon is married, is he faithful to his wife? Because that's what Paul wants to cultivate in the church. It's leaders who are setting a good example for Christian marriages if they are married. Right. And that Christian marriage is to be different from pagan marriage in that, there's this expectation that husband and wife will maintain their lifelong commitments to one another and be exclusive in that sense. But saying that is not the same thing as saying a man must be married in order to serve as a deacon, right? And if Paul wanted to say that, he had language available to him to say that.
Right.
And this isn't that language.
Well, it's also interesting that, if that is the route you want to take, that and we're getting off track, but that's okay. But if you want to take that approach, that your church leaders, your elders and your deacons both have to be men who have one living spouse at the moment, then both Jesus and Paul are unqualified to be elders and deacons because neither of them were married. You should rethink your
rules if your rules would disqualify Jesus and Paul from serving in your church.
Yes.
Sorry, Jesus, sorry, Paul, but Paul, you wrote this thing about being the husband of one wife.
But we laugh about that,
right.
But there is a serious implication here, and I don't know if we really want to try to dive into this right now. But the issue we were talking about earlier with what you do with verse 11 and this issue of women, you can make a very strong case that women were deacons or deaconesses in the early church, both because of the way it's worded here in 1 Timothy, the fact that Phoebe, who is a female, is labeled as a deacon of the church of Cenchrea. I mean, we only get 4 passages that even remotely talk about deacons, and 2 of them imply that women can have that role.
Right.
How many of our churches today have women in a deacon position?
Right.
Mostly due to our interpretive traditions that they're not allowed to, or our own sense of well, the women shouldn't be in this position at all, so we're just going to eliminate from them everything.
Yeah. And when you boil it back down to what do deacons do? They serve.
Right.
Why on earth would we want to restrict women as children of God, filled with and equipped and gifted by the Holy Spirit, just as men are? Mm-hmm. Why would we want to restrict them from serving in the church? Right? It doesn't make any sense. And in an official sense, there's no reason that I can see to take that restrictive position, because women are just as much servants of God as are men in the church. And you're right, that could take us a whole long rabbit trail there, but let's do that, Keith. Let's we've hit on this several times, but let's spend a couple more moments focused on it. What do deacons do? What should they do in the local church?
Okay. I think, again, we're kind of grasping a bit just because we're not given that much in terms of information regarding it. But looking at the stuff that we do have, when we look at Acts 6, when we look at 1 Timothy 3, we can get a couple of indications of at least some basics of what they do. So, for example, in Acts 6, they were chosen to wait tables, which is, I know where the name comes from, but also, that was the specific need that was there. And so we could say, based upon that one of the roles a deacon should have is service in the sense of meeting the needs of the people where they are at. So maybe that is handling benevolence requests, both within the congregation and without. Maybe that is quite literally waiting tables. We talk about, the Lord's table when we have communion. And so, maybe the deacons are the ones that at least help or oversee or are a part of the service of that. If you're having a giant fellowship meal, maybe the deacons are a part of that process as well.
Right.
Looking at 1 Timothy 3, One of the things that gets brought out here, when it talks about, being husband of one wife and a good manager of one's household, if that idea of faithfulness and management are important characteristics for deacons, likely one of the things they're going to be doing is helping to manage in a faithful way what goes on in the church. And so,
Affairs of the church, yes.
building and grounds, finances, that kind of stuff. Maybe that falls under the purview of deacons, or would fall under the purview of deacons.
Right.
Another one would be there's a unique word used at the opening part of this, where the deacons should not be double-tongued. That's not something that was applied to elders, but it is applied to deacons. And the idea behind it is that if you're going to encounter two different groups of people, you have to give those two groups of people the same message. So maybe deacons are liaisons between the leaders and the congregation as a whole, or between the congregation and the community. They need to not be double-tongued. If they're going to say one thing to one group of people, they need to say the same thing to the other group of people.
Interesting. I never thought about that part of it, Keith. I like that kind of liaison, representative and messenger kind of role,
And I think if we throw that in there, what happens with Stephen and Philip makes a whole lot more sense.
Yeah, because they become representatives, evangelists, right? Representatives of the church to the community. Yeah, that's cool. I like that a lot. That kind of opens up some different windows and different doors for thinking about what deacons do than some of the other ways that it's traditionally been thought about.
Right.
Yeah, I like that.
Add to that list.
Yeah. So, and I think probably the bottom line here is that, deacons need to be serving in ways that meet the specific needs of the church, right? Whatever those might be, right? In other words, it shouldn't be prefabricated so much as sensitive and responsive to where the church is at, right? And of course, there are ongoing areas of service, like in Christian churches and churches of Christ, we celebrate the Lord's Supper every Sunday. So, overseeing and being involved in the celebration of the supper is ongoing. If you have a church building and grounds and finances are ongoing needs and responsibilities, right? So it's not like deacons can't have some ongoing or long-lasting responsibilities, but there also needs to be an aspect of what they do that is responsive, right? Like, okay, we recognize that this specific need has arisen, and maybe it's a need in the community, right? And going back to this whole idea of representing the church to the community or being the liaison, maybe the community has this need, and the deacons can well represent the church and Jesus Christ by going and helping to meet that need in the community in some way.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, again, using Acts 6 as a template, all congregations are going to be made up of a variety of different people. And it's very easy. Yeah, we're not distributing food the way they were in the church in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, but or at least most of us aren't. But it's easy to overlook some people for the sake of other people, or to exclude some people because they're different from us. So perhaps, and I don't even know if a whole lot of churches even consider this, much less do this in practice. But perhaps one role for the deacons of a church is to be the ones to say, hey, as we're making decisions, as we are, choosing our ministries, as we're going through the various things that we do, we want to make sure we don't overlook this other group of people that aren't immediately, in this conversation.
I really like that too, that it's their job to make sure that nobody is overlooked or excluded.
Right.
Yeah, I really like that. That's also rich and very Christ-like, attending to the least of these, so to speak, or just making us more aware of our own prejudices, right, and blind spots. Yeah, I like that a lot. Well, is there anything else that we should address on this topic of deacons?
Um, mm, so I will say, just kind of giving a little more background, and this isn't necessarily needed, but it's something I want to do anyway. Is that part of the reason this is a difficult conversation to have is that there isn't precedence for it outside the church. And when we looked at elders, there's a very wide array of background for that. We can look at the way elders existed in Jewish communities, 1,000 years before the church came into existence. We can look at how elders worked or how leaders worked within the local synagogues of the Jewish people. We can look at how the elders as a patriarchal role within a family worked. Now there's a lot of different scenarios that we can use for eldership, but that doesn't exist for deacons. The concept of deacons as an office, as a church leadership position, originates within the New Testament in Paul's writings and the book of Acts. That this isn't something that existed in Jewish culture. This isn't something that existed in the Greco-Roman world. Yes, they had servants. And so this Greek word, diakonia or diakonos, applies to a wide range of different people, the servants of a king, the servants of an idea, the servants of a local organization type of thing. But the idea of that not just being, all right, you're the one that's going to wait on me, but actually being a specific group of people, a specific position that they are chosen for, that they are given responsibility over, that is unique and original to the church.
What I'm thinking, Keith, as you're talking about that, generally speaking, servants were lowly.
Right.
You're low on the social economic ladder if you're a servant, right? Maybe a diakonos is a step above a doulos, right? A slave, right? But you're low, but Jesus, and I know you have this in our notes, Jesus, Mark chapter 10, when James and John came to him wanting to sit on his right and his left when he comes into his kingdom, and he says, no, you got it all wrong. To James and John and the rest of the disciples, and he says, "Son, it's not that the Son of Man came to be served, diakoneo, right? But came to serve, diakoneo, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And so Jesus establishes self-humbling service as the expectation for all of his followers. They will serve others and serve one another in self-humbling, self-giving, even self-sacrificial ways.
Right.
And so then the early church, whether it's Acts 6 that initiates this or not, at some point kind of institutionalizes that, right? Like elevates the serving role from being lowly to this is a respected position, right? Yes, it's something that's expected of all of us as disciples of Jesus, but some of us are kind of appointed to lead the way in that, right? To lead by example as servants, responding to needs out of the heart of Christ. That also really cool.
And it very much puts an actual, I don't even know what the word I want to use here is. It gives us a way to actually work out in practice in daily life the command of Jesus that the greatest shall be the least. And if you want to try to elevate yourself, you have to be willing to be the servant of everyone. And again, those passages where he talks about that in Matthew and in Mark, the greatest shall be the least, shall be the servant of all. It is the same word, diakoneo. So the idea of, we don't degrade those who serve by any stretch.
You don't look down on them. They're not beneath us. Right.
They should be respected. They should perhaps even be elevated, and in that sense, it makes sense for it to be a role within the church, or even a leadership position within the church. But at the same time, because it is a servant role,
yes,
if you are in that position, you can't elevate yourself either.
Yes, that's right. Yes, you got yes. And we're all, as human beings, we're all prone to that kind of self-elevation thing, right? No, you embrace the servant mindset and the humble mindset. This is about Jesus and his people, not about me. Right? And if you are elevated in any way, it's because others are looking at your genuine service and saying, there's an example we can follow, right? Of what it looks like to follow Jesus and serve others, and that's that sincerity of heart and that purity of heart, maintaining that in leadership, whatever leadership role, deacon, elder, pastor, whatever leadership role, maintaining that is so crucial, right, to leadership in the church. And that's one of the, it might be the most important distinction between Christian leadership and worldly leadership.
And I think about this for myself as well quite a bit. There are a variety of titles that get used to refer to the main person in a church. We can call that person the preacher. A lot of times we call that person the pastor. In some denominations, we call them reverend.
Or the minister.
Yeah, minister is the title that, if I'm going to use a title, minister is the one I prefer as a reference for myself. And that is because of this conversation. When we talk about this word diakoneo, diakonos, we can translate that as servant, we can translate that as deacon, we can also translate that as minister.
Yeah, so when you see minister in the New Testament, almost always the word diakonos or diakoneo is the Greek word behind it.
Right. And so in Ephesians and Colossians and other places, when Paul says, I, Paul, am a minister of the gospel, this is this word that, he is a deacon of the gospel. He's a servant of the gospel. And I think, as somebody in leadership within a local congregation, for me, myself, I want to keep that approach that, maybe I'm the guy in charge, but I'm still a servant. I'm still a minister. And it's up to me as well as anybody else to say, I'm not better than everybody else. I'm not superior to everybody else. I'm still striving as Jesus did to serve, to not be served.
Yes. I wholeheartedly agree with you, Keith. And if we're going to use titles, I'm not big into titles. I just prefer for people to call me Nate. But if we're going to use them in any way, I think that one serves the purpose of helping to keep us humble, right? And keep our mindset in the right place, as you just described. So, so much good stuff here. I've actually been a little bit surprised at this, Keith. I didn't know that this conversation was going to lead to some of the insights that it's led to, but it's turned out to be very rich, and I very much appreciate it. And I hope we hope it's beneficial to you. We hope that just thinking through these things and the terminology of the New Testament, it helps you gain a deeper insight into what service in the church, whether you're a deacon or in any other way, is supposed to be all about.
Yeah, and I think, as a baseline, again, there's a lot of ambiguity here, but we are all servants, whether we have that official title or not, we're all servants. We're all called to serve.
Yeah, and the New Testament applies that specific language to all believers.
Right. And so, the things we've talked about, the qualifications found in 1 Timothy 3, the standards set forth for the men in Acts 6, and the desire for, there to be this universal approach to everybody and not prejudicial approaches or, leaving people out and that kind of stuff. All of that, again, if you are a deacon in an elected position in a church, or you're just the average person sitting on the very last pew, all of this applies to you. We need to not be double-tongued. We need to be faithful in what we're doing. We need to be full of wisdom and full of the Spirit and willing to serve whoever, however, whenever, wherever.
For sure. All I can say is a hearty amen. So I don't think that Keith and I have agreed where we want to take this this small town pastors vlog next, but we will decide,
Yes.
and we will let you know. And we look forward to the next conversation.
And if you have any questions or thoughts or comments, feel free to reach out to either one of us directly, or, wherever you find this video, to leave it in a comment there. We're always happy to get whatever feedback. Now, this very much is a conversation for the two of us. We enjoyed this immensely, and we learn a lot from one another, but we're glad to have you joining in with us. And so if you're able to do that in a very real sense, we encourage you to do so.
Yep, for sure. See you next time.
Until then.